Hi artists! This week I want us to learn a few tips on how to add more details to our drawings through the use of texture. Texture is how something feels. So when you look at your table or your desk, how does it feel? What words would you use to describe how it feels? I think this is hard, but it's also smooth. Now think about petting a dog or a cat. What words would you use to describe how those feel? Soft? Furry? Now think about touching the bark of a tree. How does a tree feel? Well, it's probably hard, but it's not smooth. Bark can be a little rough, right? Now, when we draw on a smooth piece of paper, like a tree, it might be hard to show how it feels. So instead, we need to learn some tips on how artists use the illusion of texture with different kinds of lines that they can draw. So let's create an example together so we can practice making textures, and at the same time, let's learn how to draw a tree. This tree will be in fall, so it's not going to have any leaves on it. It's just going to be a bare-limbed tree, and I think that's a really important place to start learning how to draw a tree. And then later, if you want, you can then add leaves to it. Let's learn how to draw a basic tree. When we think of a tree, well, it has a trunk to it, right? So I'm going to start with just two simple lines for the trunk. It's going to be a nice wide trunk. I want it to be kind of a big tree. Now, when a tree grows, well, it's not just one piece of wood all the way up. There's usually limbs and branches coming off. So how do we take this one piece and divide it into two? Well, there's a really easy trick. Let's first draw two lines for our trunk, and then to divide this, I'm going to draw a V shape in between. And that splits this tree trunk, into two. So after I draw that V, I'm going to let my tree grow a little bit. So it's going to grow this way, and it's going to grow this way. See how I have the trunk? And now two big branches. Those branches are going to keep growing. And when they grow, they're going to keep dividing. So kind of like our tree trunk here, if we look at this, we have the same thing. We have two lines next to each other. We can add a V inside. And then let that tree grow a little bit more. And then we can keep repeating this if we want. Look, there's another two sets of lines that we can divide into two and let it grow. Now, if you want any of these branches to stop, you just need to grow it until they come together. And then that branch will stop right there. You decide how big and where it's going to grow. Alright, I think that's a pretty good start for a tree. I could have drawn my lines a little bit neater, but that's why you should do it in pencil first so you can clean up some of those lines. I'm, as always, using a marker so you can see what I'm drawing a little bit better on the camera, but I always use a pencil first. Now, we're not done yet with this tree. It's got an open bottom. The bottom of the tree should lead into some roots, but we're not going to see all of the roots because they grow underground, so we're just going to see a couple of the roots. So it's almost like the top of the tree, but a lot shorter. So I'm going to create some kind of like a zigzag line. I'll keep it simple. You can have really fancy roots or real simple roots. It's really up to you. but I like to do kind of like a zigzag line for the bottom. Alright, now right now, our tree is floating in space. It's gotta have a ground. Now let's think 2 projects ago when we were learning about backgrounds. What's the first thing that I should add to my background before I add anything else? It's a horizon line. Now, everyone wants to add that horizon line right at the bottom of where their tree is. And you could do that, but you could move this horizon line a little higher up. That way it looks like there's some more ground here and you have more room to add different things. I think it's better to have it a little higher up than having your tree right on the line. And definitely don't have it below the tree, or else it looks like your tree is floating in the air. So, like I said, I'm gonna put mine probably about right there. So let me add that. And you can use a ruler, but if it's outside and it's the ground is never completely flat. And of course, this line is gonna go behind my tree because my tree is in front of the horizon. Okay? So now I've got the ground, I've got a tree. Let's talk about adding some texture to this. So as I said, we're going to be adding a texture to show how this tree feels. And as we discussed, this tree is hard and rough. So let's think of the different lines that we know. We have straight lines, we have wavy lines, we have zigzag lines, and maybe dashed or dotted, all sorts of different lines that we can use, but there's all sorts of different lines in between. So for my tree, well, it feels like a birch tree. That bark is really smooth, so maybe more straight lines would be good. The rougher the tree, the bumpier the line, because a bumpy line shows how rough it is, how it feels. So when I'm looking at my tree, I'm going to go for a rough bark on it. And I'm going to have lines that go in the direction that the tree grows, because if you look at a tree, the bark that's growing on it usually grows from bottom to top. So for my bark, I'm going to do short, little, bumpy lines. Alright, now there are a lot more ways of adding texture to a tree than just bumpy lines, but this is just one example to get you thinking about how you might want your tree to look. But it's going to depend on how your tree grows. Maybe there's a big knot growing in the center of it. A knot is where maybe there used to be a branch, but the branch broke off and the tree healed itself. And you can do that using a spiral and then draw lines going around that spiral, because you show the grain of the wood and then the wood growing around it. All these little tips and tricks you'll learn if you look closely at the lines on a tree. Alright, so I think that's pretty good for a rough looking tree. Let's think of the grass now. How does grass feel? It can be a little pointy, right? It can also be pretty soft. So I'm probably not going to use a bumpy line because grass has got straight blades to it, right? So I think I'm going to use short, straight lines to add the look of grass. Now, we don't want to cover the whole thing. That's too much to cover. So all you need are a couple lines to give the illusion that it's grass. So think of it like tiny little clumps. Maybe a clump of 3 blades of grass, maybe a couple there. If you look at comics or cartoons, you'll see that this is what artists usually do. They'll just randomly put them, maybe even growing right up next to the tree, maybe in between the roots. All you need are a couple short lines, and then suddenly it's got a texture to it. It looks like short, mowed, but pointy and smooth grass. Now, we can do this to anything we draw on our picture. Let's look at clouds. I'm gonna add some clouds to my sky. My favorite are the ones that are kind of flat on the bottom and bouncy on top. Now inside that cloud, I could add some texture. And I'm going to copy the way this cloud looks. Clouds are soft and fluffy. And I think bouncing lines or wavy lines are great for showing something that's soft. So pointy is kind of rough to feel, and wavy feels softer. Think of what a wavy or a pointy surface would actually feel like with your hand. That's kind of what you got to think about when you think about what kind of line to use when you're adding texture. So for my cloud, I'm going to do short, bouncy lines to add a fluffy texture to it. Now, from here, I want you guys to think about what other details you'd like to add to your picture. What else could you add to it? Maybe more trees off in the distance? Animals? Is there any animals in the tree or on the ground? Is there a house over here? There's lots of room for a house or houses. Maybe it's a whole city. Or maybe it's out in the middle of nowhere and there's mountains or a volcano off in the distance. After you draw those extra details, think about what texture you could add to some of those. Alright, if you have time, you can color this. Just be careful not to color so hard that you cover up all of your beautiful details. So maybe color lightly so you can still see your lines, or use dark colors to trace over your lines and lighter colors to color on top so you can still see them showing through. But color is optional this week. I at least want to see your tree, background, and texture added, and then as always, take a picture of this and post it into our Seesaw activity. Can't wait to see what you guys make.